do is tie maybe one of my current top patterns for smallmouth bass, subsurface that is, and that's a variation of a Murdich Minnow. Murdich Minnows have been around for a number of years, originally designed for striped bass, but this pattern has caught numerous species of fish for me, including muskie, trout, and other species, but I use this a lot for bass. And I love the original pattern, but just like anything else, fly tyers have a tendency of just tying flies or modifying flies based on just maybe the materials that they have available, but also just kind of some tweaks that they find just maybe gives the fly a little bit more action. So I don't claim this to be any more effective than the original. The original is fantastic, but one of the things that we're going to do is just add some foam, kind of like a hind end of foam, to give that fly a little more flotation and a little bit more kick during the pause. So to get started here, I use a lot of the B10S's, anything with the kind of a shorter shank, wider gap hook I like. If you want to, what we can do is we can use our jaws, crimp the barb down. This is a B10S. Anything comparable would be fine. We're going to do 6/0 white tying thread. It doesn't really matter, to be honest with you. Get tying thread down. Now, what we're going to do here, our first material is going to be some white bucktail. But before I tie in this white bucktail, what I'm going to do here is get my clump of hair. Now, this clump of hair is going to kind of almost act as a rudder. It kind of helps steer the ship, so to speak, but also it's going to act as a foundation to keep the flash, which is the top layer of the tail, from fouling and getting too out of control during the presentation. So we're just going to take a little liberal amount of bucktail like this, kind of even the tips up as much as you can, and sometimes I'll go maybe about 2 times the width. With bass patterns, this is a pattern I'm using now right now for mostly bass. When I tie this right now, this is mostly for a bass. Bass have bigger mouths, not like trout, where trout will often kind of just nitpick, not saying that bass won't. But with this, when I'm tying flies for bass, single hook point flies, I don't mind keeping a very long tail and keeping the hook point a little closer on the front 1/3 towards the hook eye, if you will. So I get my measurement and I trim this. And before I actually use my tying thread, I'm just going to use a little super glue right here. Lay that down. That's going to help kind of keep these fibers from spinning. Now with deer hair, depending on what part of the hair that you're using, I'm making very loose wraps right now at first. Just enough tension to kind of hold it in place, but what we don't want is for this tail to flare off to the side. We're trying to keep this tail as nice and tight as possible. So at the very end, I may really kind of pull that down, tighten that up a bit. Then we're going to go back. A little looser, slight tension, but just kind of keep a tight bunch. And if we have any sort of stray characters in here, we can always trim them out just a bit. So there's our tail, nice and tight. Our top layer is going to be our flash, and this is just a pearl flashabou. I'm going to pick out and isolate maybe, I don't know, 15 strands or so. Trim that, and then I'm going to double this up as well. So I got my flash, and then I'm going to double this up. I'm going to lay the tips right off the back end. Lots of flash here. Lay that down. Make 1 or 2 wraps just to secure it. And again, another little drop of glue. A few more tighter wraps. If you need to trim the back end flash, you can do that to even out the tips. Then what we're going to do is just fold this little flap of flash backwards. The original, we would tie in kind of a rear section of synthetic, and then you would fold the flash over top. But for this, I've been just pretty much just cutting the flash right now as is, folding that back, so it kind of gives you another kind of, I guess you could say, height in the in the tail. So originally, what the original pattern had would be near hair, where you would tie in a clump of hair on the far side and one on the near side to kind of create a clump, which would kind of act as a rudder or kind of as a kicker, allowing the fly to kick and move. But one of the things I've been doing lately is I've been using like white 2mm foam. I get mine from Foley Mills. And I just basically just trim this down into kind of a narrow little gap here. And what we're going to do is pretty much right where our deer hair is tied in, we're going to try to create a little bit of bulk in the rear end. So when you're presenting the fly, especially sideways, when current hits it, this middle section of the fly, or basically the third of the fly right here, is going to be a little bit bulkier, a little thicker, so when current hits it, it's going to get that fly to kick and turn. So we're just going to lay the foam here, literally on basically level with the deer hair, and just secure this right onto the side. We're going to do a pinch towards me, and depending on how shallow or how much movement, or depending on what type of sinking line that you're using, can determine like how much foam you're actually using. But for this, I'm going to go just a little shorter than the flash, the top layer of the flash. And if you want to trim this down a little bit, you can do that. We're going to do the same thing on the near side. And a lot of the waters I'm fishing right now, I'm fishing this with an intermediate line, which we'll talk about when we're on the water. But I like this fly. It's really kind of neutral buoyant. So meaning that when this fly is in the water column, it's not going to really elevate and it's not going to drop. There's just enough flotation within the foam and the deer hair to kind of keep this back end from dropping down. So when you have a bass that's following the fly during the presentation and you pause it, the fly just kind of stays hanging in the water column or kind of slaying or swinging off to the side. But I'm not looking for a pattern that's dropping. I'm pretty much just looking for a fly that just stalls and maybe just moves horizontally in the water column rather than dropping vertical. I'm going to trim this on the side here. Color variations, again, you can do whatever colors you want. But we're going to just trim that right there. So there's our back end. Simple little fly. Love this little thing. And then the next part for this size fly, this is a V10S. This is a size 2, so slightly larger. I will tie this a lot smaller. I'll go all the way down to a size 10 for some of the smaller bass waters I fish. But for this size 2, I'm going to use the white Grande Estes. Grande is the size. It's kind of a larger, thicker, or wider material, I guess you could say. We're just going to tie this in right in front of the foam. Lock that in nice and tight. And then just take your thread. We're going to proceed all the way down to the end. I do like to create a little bit of a layer of thread, so as you are wrapping this chenille or this Estes, it doesn't slip. It kind of creates a little bit of a bite. We can kind of just orient some of these fibers and kind of pull them in one direction as we're wrapping. You can always comb them out a little bit later on. This is such a really good pattern. You can do whatever color combinations. I know a lot of anglers will just tie this in white and use a permanent marker and mark it whatever color they want. For me, locally, I just pretty much just use white all the time, and it does a really good job imitating a lot of the young of the year fall fish that are hatched or recently hatched here in July and June in Pennsylvania. I see a lot of fish when I'm catching them are spitting out these really tiny, like 1 to 2 inch young of the year fall fish. We're going to just keep wrapping this all the way up. The Estes does a nice job. It creates a nice full body. You can use a number of materials. I use streamer brushes sometimes. I'll use a Palmer chenille. It doesn't really matter, but the Estes and the Grande for this is just what I use most of the time. It's just my comfort material, I guess you can say. We're going to secure this, and we're just going to fold everything back here. Pinch. Try to get any and all those stray hairs back. We're going to wrap back. Base layer, fold a little bit back, a little bit more. Clean this head up a little bit. do the old Whitlock super glue splice. You can use UV resin. I'm still kind of an old school super glue guy. And I'll just do a little overhand knot to lock that in place. Scissors, trim. There you have it. This is a very simple modification of the Murdich Minnow. It's got insane amount of action. When this thing kicks, this before the Murdich Minnow would give you a little bit of a nice little kick off the side, but when you strip this and pause it nice and hard, especially that back end with that foam, it just has a nice, really beautiful little gliding motion off to the side. So the thing I like about this pattern is I can cast this, especially when I'm trying to pitch something up under tight brush. When you are going under brush, you have a tendency, I know I have a tendency of like trying to overpower, trying to use too much wrist. And if you're fishing an articulated fly or a fly that's got multiple shanks, that hard erratic motion has a tendency of jackknifing, kind of just creating a bait ball, getting your fly to foul itself before it hits the water. And nothing is more frustrating than making this nice little cast under a brush and then just finding out that your fly has turned into a bait ball. So anytime I'm fishing streams for smallmouth or any fish species for that matter, I like using single hook point streamers. So when I do have a tendency of jerking the wrist too much or overpowering the wrist, the fly is far less likely to foul itself during the presentation. But easy to cast, super easy to cast, very simple to tie. And when you lose one of these flies, you're not going to lose too much sleep. I use the game changers on a regular basis, but I only use the game changers for bass, like when the water gets really low and clear, when those fish really have a tendency of taking a much longer view or look at your pattern before deciding to go or not. But this pattern is really easy. It's got lots of action, and for probably 90% of my fishing throughout the year for smallmouth bass, this is really all I need. So this is just a little variation of the Murdich Minnow. I hope you like it, hope you try it, hope you use it, and I hope it works for you. Have a great day. So with this approach, we're just going to make a short little cast here just to demonstrate. Once the line is nice and clean, here we can reach out, make sure we have line leader control, make sure your line hand is up near your rod hand. We're going to just hit it, pop, pop, hit, pop, pop. And then after every pop, I'm going to just kind of lean, just create a little slack between me and my fly. If you strip and then keep the rod tip pulling back towards you, you never allow the fly to glide naturally or smoothly after the retrieve. So what I mean by that is we're not just going to keep the rod tip stripping like this. What we're going to do, we're going to make a cast, clean up the line, hit it, and then reach, create a little bit of slack between you and your fly, hit it again, maybe clean things up, and then hit it again. But there's a cadence and there's a nice pause between each strip and pause, and that just allows this Murdich Minnow just this beautiful little kick. It's not like a 90 degrees, sometimes it's more like a 30 to like a 45, but it's just this nice little sway off to the side just on that pause, and then that keel helps reorient the fly back to its normal position. But it's such a wonderful pattern with lots of movement for very little effort from a tying standpoint. Kick, kick, pause, pause. And this is where if you have a loop knot, when you pause it, it's just going to allow that fly to have a lot more movement. I don't use a loop knot in all my streamer tactics, especially ones where I'm maintaining constant tension. But if I'm making a cast and I'm intentionally putting slack into that presentation, and that's proof in the pudding right here. This is one of the better bass here. We'll put this on spot lock, hold the boat here because we're going to a good location. But this is what's kind of nice about this, is that when you have a slow sinking fly line like this and a neutral buoyant streamer, it just kind of keeps it moving. And especially like a lot of your larger bass, at least on my home waters, they usually don't want the fly ripping this time of the year in the summer. They just want the fly to kind of hang, suspend, and then they usually take it as it's hanging or as it's sliding, but rarely are they taking it as I'm ripping the fly. And that was on the pause, and I did not feel the strike. I just saw the fly disappear, and that was my indicator to set the hook. But this is one of the reasons why I really like this game. It's such a visual game where you'll just see the white minnow moving, drifting, and then you see this little shadow appear. The white fly disappears, you set the hook, and you've got yourself a quality bass. So not a bad way to spend the morning. One of the best tips I can give anyone fishing sinking fly lines, heavy flies, is avoiding this right here. People think it's often cool to have so much force and so much cast that you're shooting all the line, and then the line's pulling back and you can hear that line getting pulled off the reel. And that may be good, that showing that you are a good caster, but what this is doing, this is jackknifing your presentation. It's pulling everything back, causing a lot of slack, and it's causing tangles in your hand. And then you got to strip 1, 2, 3, 4 strips before you're in control. So if you're fishing sinking fly lines, heavy flies where there's going to be a lot of movement or a lot of mass moving away from you, strip out a little bit of line. Don't cast all of it, but just allow that line to shoot through the guides during the cast. And that allows you to lay the line out nice and smooth, avoiding that kickback and giving you control from start to finish. So have a little bit of line to give, a little bit of line to shoot, and it's going to avoid that nasty kickback and give you control from start to finish.